Hello and welcome to this edition of the online seminar series presented to you by Slovenski Dom. I'm honored to have been asked to share with you some of my passion and some knowledge in and around natural medicines of Slovenia, prirodne medicine. And so today I'd like to take the opportunity to share some of that information with you. This whole seminar I did about 10 years ago at Dom Lipa, and it was based on a series of articles that I wrote for Glasilo magazine, which I think is still available these days, that was titled Study at Science. And Study at Science was basically an exploration of traditional folk medicine, predominantly herbs, and looking at how those herbs were used traditionally in Slovenia and how modern scientific knowledge is lending a whole new understanding of how these herbs work and how they can be helpful in promoting health and well-being in our lives. And so today I'm going to use that template of Study at Science, but to share with you some herbs that I've looked at recently that I find are really exciting and can be a really wonderful part of your day-to-day living. But before we go forward, who is Stariata? Stariata is essentially an archetype, right? It is an archetype of sort of the old world knowledge that we all have in our blood, in our DNA. And where do we get some of this archetypal knowledge from, especially related to plant medicine? There's a few sources that I draw on personally for this type of information, one of which is Simon Asic, who is a monk who passed away in, I believe, 1992. But he was a monk and herbalist at Stichna, which is a monastery near Dolenska from about he passed away in 1992. And he brought a lot of plant knowledge to the forefront in Slovenia, and there's a great amount of information on the internet if you want to look him up. There's a lot that you can learn there from his writings and his work. Also, I've recently come to learn about a resurgence of a traditional, sort of, not society, but a traditional way of thinking and being that has its roots in Slovenia called the Staroverci, or the Old Believers. That I'll get into a little bit more detail as we go along, but I'm starting to draw a little bit more information from the Old Believers and their perspective and relationship to nature. But also, this archetype of Stariata is my father, who had great plant knowledge, my mother, my grandparents, my staramama, my uncles, my aunts, you, the community, the feedback that I used to receive when I wrote those articles. All of that is really contributing to this deeper understanding of where this medicine comes from, how ingrained and how much a part of our society or our culture it is as Slovenians. And I want to share some of that with you today. And before I go on, I just want to touch a little bit on the Staroverci. This is something that, again, is really starting to emerge as something that I'm hoping to explore more in my own research and understanding. But they were followers of the old faith. Basically a nature-based spirituality with a deep connection to animals, plants, to nature, all nature being imbued with spirit. It was a pre-Christian tradition. And the knowledge we have that is retained from that tradition comes from the Socha Valley. And that's about 50 kilometers away from where my maternal grandmother's roots are from. And so I feel a really deep kinship and connection to this whole tradition. And I feel like this pre-Christian tradition and figures like Simon Asic in the Christian tradition have really helped to bring that knowledge forward into these newer generations, such as myself and those of you who might be listening. So we'll kind of dive into some of their perspectives as we move along. I come to you with this information as a Slovenian Canadian, but also as a naturopathic doctor. I have been practicing in my clinic in London, Ontario, which is about 2 hours southwest of Toronto. I've been practicing for about 11 years, and my passion really is nutrition and plant medicine, and it really does stem from my roots as to why I've become a naturopathic doctor. And some of the forefathers of naturopathic medicine actually have their roots in Slovenia and near Slovenia. One notable figure is Father Sebastian Kneipp, who really If you look at any of the hot springs or any of these healing centers in Slovenia or Hungary or Germany are really drawing on the tradition of Father Kneipp. And there's also a figure named Arnold Rickley, who was a Swiss doctor in the early 1900s, who moved and set up a natural health center in Bled, on the shores of Lake Bled. And the last time I was in Slovenia, I actually was able to visit the ruins, or basically what's left of the building of that natural health center, right on the lakeshore of Bled. So those are some connections there as well that really tie into my profession. Today, I really want to sort of dive into 3 natural medicines. I initially had called this a plant medicines of Slovenia, but actually 2 of the medicines I'll be talking about today aren't actually plants. So that's why I've sort of changed the name to natural medicines. And today we're going to talk about why do we want to talk about natural medicine, and we're going to meet these medicines and we're going to talk a little bit of detail around them. We'll talk about how they work, how they were used traditionally in Slovenia, some of the scientific understanding that is being brought to these medicines, and how we might prepare or consider using these in our day-to-day lives. So why plants? Why natural medicine? Why is it important to sort of explore our cultural roots this way? Well, natural medicine is very accessible. The medicines I'll be talking about today really exist at our feet, out our back door, in our backyard, in the forests around us. So the accessibility is there. And there is efficacy. If we can use these in a wise way, in a gentle way, in a consistent way, they can have really great benefit for helping us maintain a happy, healthy lifestyle. And there's a real sustainability element to it as well. And it really kind of gives us some empowerment as we're connecting to our roots, our figurative roots in terms of our cultural roots, but also the roots that grow in the ground. And so that's something I find, at least personally, very empowering in that. And part of that is really trying to keep the tradition of this way of living, this way of interacting with nature and natural medicines alive. It's a tradition, but can we keep that tradition going? And so in the same way that we have dance groups in Toronto that keep the polka vibe alive, I hope to bring a little bit to keep this tradition of folk medicine alive in our culture in Canada. And I want to be able to share this with generations moving forward so that they can be more proactive in their health. And so let's move into meeting the medicines that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about 3 of my favorite medicines. They're my favorite because they're effective, they're delicious in certain ways, and they're just amazing to come across in nature. First, we're going to talk about a mushroom or a fungus. In Slovenian, it's called Poleščenka. We're going to talk about bezeg, which is elderflower or elderberry. And we're going to explore bee products such as propolis, honey, and bee pollen. Before I go any further, I just have to do my disclaimer that nothing here that I present is any sort of medical advice. You're best to take your own individual health and work with somebody who understands the context of your health and how you might incorporate some of these medicines into your life in a safe and effective way. So first, let's talk about something called Ganoderma resinaceum, which is Poleščenka. Not to be confused with another Slovenian medicine, Poleščenka. This is Poleščenka, which is a fungus that grows on dead and dying logs and trees, most predominantly growing on oak trees. And before I go into talking any detail around the medicine itself, I just like to sort of present these medicines in the form of a story. And this sort of draws on that study at the science sort of articles that I used to write for the Glasilo. And so I'll just take a minute to read a story to you. I feel that story helps us understand things in a fuller way, helps us connect to these medicines in a deeper way, and maybe helps stick in terms of our understanding of how these plant medicines might help us. It had been a busy autumn collecting food and medicines for the coming winter, and Stadiata was tired. He slept later than usual on this cold, windy morning. It was the shortest day of the year, and he could feel the darkness settle over the Socha Valley. He rose out of bed, slipped on his sopate, and walked into the kitchen where Mama had already begun to stoke the fire. She had set out the ingredients for their first pot of ciber. 3 deci vino, med, a jar of powdered polishchenka, and 3 dried tser leaves, harvested from the enormous oak tree down near the stream. He boiled the herbs or the leaves in the water, mixed the tea with vino, and added some honey. Together they said a prayer and sipped their tsiber, knowing that with nature's medicine and God's will, their winter would be a healthy, restful one. This plant is, or it's not a plant, pardon me, this fungus, which grows on, again, dead and dying logs, is one of my favorite. To come across a Ganoderma species in the forest is really an exciting event for me. I find it to be a really beautiful, beautiful mushroom. Gano means shiny or bright, and derma means skin. This says that these mushrooms have a very shiny skin. And there are many, many species of this type of mushroom, depending on the area of the world they grow in and the type of tree that they grow on. So the Resinaceum is the one that I draw on from sort of the Staroverzi and their traditional use of it, but we could really interchange this with other Ganoderma species that are maybe more researched or more plentiful. The most researched and the most understood is one called Ganoderma lucidum, which in Japanese, or in a more common name, is called reishi, or in Chinese is called lingzhi, also known as the mushroom of immortality. So it's one of the most famous medical mushrooms out there. And I think there's about $2 billion worth of sales of this mushroom in the US alone. It's really becoming very, very popular. And for good reason. Some of the actions are really quite impressive, and there is a real solid amount of research that is out there and that continues to expand our understanding of how these mushrooms can support our health. Some of the things that Ganoderma species or polishchenka can help with are adaptogenic actions. So adaptogenic herbs or mushrooms are essentially medicines that help us to adapt to stress. They give our body more resource to draw on so that we can face stressors with more vitality and vigor. Some other actions available are analgesic, so some pain relief, antibacterial, antihistamine, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and some of the big considerations here are anti-tumor, antiviral, and liver protective. And I generally look at it as a real fantastic immune modulator or immune stimulant. And so what we want to keep in mind when we think of these types of medicines, that's a really significant list. And we don't want to consider treating one particular or specific disease state with this type of medicine or mushroom. We want to consider it more like a tonic. And how can we use this seasonally, for example, as part of our day-to-day in terms of drinking tea or using it in our food to help promote health, not necessarily to treat a specific disease when we've gotten that disease. Let's think prevention more than cure. What parts do we use with the Ganoderma mushroom? We use the whole mushroom. And so this is just a bit of caution because medicinal mushrooms are gaining a lot of popularity in sort of the natural health industry. There are some companies that are essentially selling products that are not the full mushroom body, but are selling products that are what are called mycelium that are grown on the grain of the mushroom. So you would use that grain mycelium and put that into something like sawdust to actually grow a mushroom, but they're using the grain itself with sort of the fungus on it, which does not have nearly the same medicinal properties as the whole mushroom itself. So you just want to be sure whole mushroom is certainly the best way to go. How did we use this traditionally in Slovenia? And I'm drawing this information from the Staroverzi and a book from that's sort of available out there that I'll talk about in a bit. That kind of gives us some information about their way of thinking and their connection to nature. And in this book, they state their uses of using polishchenka as a winter tonic, so something that helps them through the winter months to stay healthy, helping in pain relief, in tumor prevention, and as an antibacterial and antiviral, and to strengthen something called spalno moč, which is essentially libido. And so some Staroverzi would drink this in a tea form from the winter solstice, so just before Christmas, all the way to the beginning of Lent, or through Lent. And I essentially like to do the same thing. I like to use local reishi mushrooms or Polishchenka in a crock pot tea combined with the next medicine that I'm going to talk about, and just drinking that intermittently throughout the winter seasons to keep myself healthy and vital. Some of the scientific understanding of the Polishchenka, basically we're looking at two main constituents or chemicals or nutrients in these mushrooms that are basically what are giving us our medicinal action. First are what are called polysaccharides, which are basically like a starch or a cellulose, basically a really complex carbohydrate that really has shown some great potential in enhancing the immune status, for example, in people with cancer, in promoting immune health in general. And another chemical class called triterpenes, which have been shown to kill certain types of cancer cell lines in vitro. So there's some really compelling evidence here mounting to show that what the Staroverci once said about it being a tumor preventative, antiviral, winter tonic, that this is really starting to be confirmed in modern scientific understanding and study of these mushrooms. In my clinic, I like to use it as a supportive therapy in cancer treatment or people battling cancer. It's a nice adjunct. It's not a one-off. You know, it's a very complex disease state, and this is one support that can be offered for general immune health support, liver support, and I use it quite a bit for people who are really stressed and who lack energy and vitality. So how do we prepare this mushroom? I've already alluded to it in our Stariata Science story and how I use it myself personally, but traditionally the Staroverci would make a tea called tsiber, which would consist of 3 tser leaves, tser meaning oak, specifically the Turkey oak, which I don't think there are too many of those left in Slovenia, but this oak tree would hold its leaves all winter long as a symbol of strength and vitality through the winter months. So they would combine those dried leaves with the powdered mushroom, and they would boil that and then add equal parts vino and some honey or med, and they would drink that daily or when they were feeling a little bit low energy or like they might be getting sick. And so this is a really wonderful medicine that I think many Slovenians can get on board with. It involves mushrooms, vino, and med. What else do we need but a little bit of kruh and we're good to go. Maybe some specht too. So the next thing I want to talk about is bezeg, which is elderflower or elderberry. And again, I'd like to share a story of how we might have used this traditionally in Slovenia. Stariata stoked the fire as a pot full of bezeg fruit simmered on the stovetop. He had been cooking batches of elderberry syrup all morning and was eager to sample the quality of his latest batch. Just as he raised the wooden spoon to his lips, a frantic knock at the door caused him to startle and drop his spoon. "Ya pakaya," he muttered to himself as he went to answer the door. He had scarcely opened the door a crack when Gospa Logar began blundering. "Stariata, mali Milan, ne mora pravdihat, vročina in kolik ima, in kašla kota bo umrel. Kaj nam dajemo za bolezen? Prosim te, pomagaj nas." Calmly, Stariata turned and walked to his pantry and emerged carrying a jar of freshly simmered syrup and a bag of dried elder flowers. With his voice full of calm confidence, he instructed Gospa Logar how to use the medicine properly. Flowers for the lungs and fever, syrup for the colic and the cough. 2 days later, she returned, her face full of relief, and little Milan smiling in her arms. So that kind of illustrates some of the actions of elderberry, which has gained a lot of popularity these days, like the mushroom, for good reason. Some of these actions include being antiviral, a febrifuge, which is basically a medicine that can help break a fever appropriately, anti-inflammatory and analgesic. It can be helped to treat skin burns, treat coughs, stimulate the immune system, help as a digestive aid. So there are some really well-rounded actions to bezeg, and it's really quite easy to harvest, easy to grow. The parts used are predominantly the flower and the berry, although there's some really deeper understanding and emergence around the use of the leaves, the dried leaves, as opposed to the berry in the treatment of certain types of viral infections. Some of the newer ones that have been floating around for the last year or so, that the leaves seem to be more appropriate to use in that context versus the berries. Simon Asic would use the dried flowers as a tea for treating lungs and treating the blood. Chisti kri, he would say. It would cleanse the blood, and maybe that means cleansing the blood of viral infections, for example. And he would use it antivirally to treat influenza traditionally, and that's the flowers. The flowers can also, again, be used as, the fancy words are febrifuge and diaphoretic. It means that they produce heat in the system to help push a fever through. Keeping in mind that fevers are really the body's attempt to heat up and kill off viruses or bacteria. So we don't want to suppress fevers if they're in that right spot for us in terms of, not being too high of a fever, but not suppressing that fever. Taking a tea of this before bed can help push that fever, break that fever, and help us get over the edge in terms of our flu, for example. The cough syrup made from ripe berries is another real traditional way to help ingest it as an antiviral. Really something that children don't mind eating or taking in, especially if you're adding it again with a little bit of honey. So it's a really family-friendly medicine as well. There's a good deal of scientific research that's illuminating its antiviral, anti-inflammatory, and immune stimulant actions. And so I'll quote one study that was done looking at influenza A and B. This was done in Norway, and people were given 15 milliliters of syrup 4 times a day while they were ill, and they saw symptom relief about 4 days earlier than people who did not receive this medication, and they received less medication versus the placebo group. And another study showed that 93% of people with flu infections showed marked improvement and or cure within 2 to 3 days of onset of flu versus an average of 6 days for people that were treated with a conventional antiviral or didn't receive any treatment at all. So that's about 3 to 4 days less of feeling sick. So if you've ever had a bad flu, you would kind of appreciate that, being sick for 3 less days is a big deal. This is all predicated on a study by a virologist who found that bezeg can help prevent certain types of viral replication in healthy cells. So again, we talked about it being the dried flower as a tea, so you can put a teaspoon per cup, steep it for a few minutes, and drink that before bed if you've got a fever. That can be nicely combined with lipa flower as well, or linden flower. It can be used as an alcohol extract. It can be, again, used as a syrup, and it can be applied externally too for things like burns or eczema, for example, or poison ivy. That can be done by adding the syrup or the tincture to fresh lard and then sort of mixing it together and applying that to the skin. So the last medicine I'd like to touch base on here is our bee products. So propolis, mid, and bee pollen. And so this is sort of under the umbrella of the bee. In Latin, the bee is called Apis mellifera, and the particular type of bee that's very common in Slovenia is the Apis mellifera carnica. But again, I'm going to share a little story to help illustrate how we might have traditionally used or employed some of these foods and medicines in our lifestyle. Stariata asked little Marica to wait at the edge of the plum orchard. She stood there, sniffling with the cold, as he lit a small bundle of dried pine needles. He carried the smoking torch toward the ornately painted Cebulnjak. These bee houses sat protected between 2 older plum trees. With billows streaming from his torch, Stariata waved the smoke toward the bees like a priest blessing a church with incense. Once pacified by the smoke, the bees allowed Atta to step forward and cut a slab of honeycomb, dripping with med from the hive. Mala, he called to Marica. Nai, nekaj sladkega za tebe. He handed her a piece and her eyes danced with joy as she stuffed her face with the waxy sweet wonder of the honeycomb. Stariata harvested the rest and gave thanks to the bees for providing honey, pollen, and propolis, delectable nourishment. And so that really illustrates how some of these bee products can really be integrated as part of our day-to-day intake of nourishment, nutrition, food. Bee products are really amazing. Again, a lot of emerging research around this. Some of the actions of the things that we're going to talk about today include being antibacterial, anti-parasitic, anti-inflammatory, antiviral, antioxidant, immune boosting, being a nutritional superfood. So these are some of the things that we're going to touch on here. Traditionally, beekeeping is, as many of our audience probably know, is a very popular pastime in Slovenia. And it goes back, as far as we can tell, and probably further, it goes back to at least the 15th century. And currently today there are over 8,000 registered beekeepers in Slovenia. And considering how Slovenia is a pretty small country, that's a significant percentage of people that are actually active beekeepers. And there is an emerging class of Canadian Slovenians that are starting to keep bees as well, which is really exciting. Essentially, Slovenia is a world leader in bee products. And I would say that Slovenia is to beekeeping what Canada is to hockey, meaning we are the gold medalists of honey and bee products. And why is this the case? Why is there such a love affair with bees and bee products? I think that part of that has to do with a man named Anton Janša, who I call the king beekeeper of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was born in Breznica in 1734 and died in Vienna in 1773. But he was the first royally appointed teacher of apiculture for all Austrian lands. And he wrote 2 defining works on beekeeping that were written in German, one called Discussion on Beekeeping and one called A Full Guide to Beekeeping. So he produced the first do-it-yourself guides to beekeeping, and this was back in the 1770s. And he became very famous for his lectures. And I think that that knowledge was such a huge base for that region of Europe and Slovenia that we really continued to draw on that knowledge, to the point where even in Radovica, between Krajin and Bled, there is a beekeeping museum that I hope to check out someday. The bee that is most common in Slovenia is Apis mellifera carnica, and it's described, all bees have very different temperaments and characteristics. The Slovenian bee, the carnica, is described as being gentle, diligent, and has a very strong sense of direction, which I think really reflects a lot of our own Slovenian qualities of gentleness, diligence, and direction. So I just find that quite poetic. Bee products can really help in terms of promoting human longevity. So if we look back at some of the cultures that have some of the oldest people on record, many of these cultures have an intimate relationship with bees and bee products. For example, in a certain mountain region of Italy, the average age pre-wars, pre-World War I, I believe, was 100 to 135 years of age. And they were really prolific beekeepers. And a pre-World War II study of tombstones of honey-producing regions in Britain showed an average age of 98 to 152 years of age. Of course, there's many modern influences that are shortening our lifespan in a lot of ways, but we do see a bit of a common thread there, that bee products can contribute to a healthier life and to perhaps more longevity. I want to speak most specifically right now to a product in the hive, in the beehive, called propolis, which many of you may be familiar with. It's a resin that basically the bees gather from poplar trees or other trees in the springtime, and they use it as a mortar to seal up their hives to protect it from bacterial infection and invasion of other bugs, etc. So it's essentially a mortar and a resin. And it might even be what is called the balm of Gilead in the Bible. There may be some allusions there to suggest that propolis is that balm of Gilead. And so just to kind of illustrate how powerful of a medicine and a substance that propolis is. Some of the main actions are antiparasitic, antiviral, antioxidant, and anti-inflammatory. Traditional Slovenian uses, there wasn't a lot in sort of research that I looked into, so I drew more on other Slavic traditions, namely Russian tradition, and Russian military hospitals used to employ the use of propolis to treat tuberculosis and certain bacterial infections that would cause ulcers in the gastrointestinal tract, namely something called H. pylori. So that antibacterial effect has traditionally shown to have a significant degree of effect treating tuberculosis and other bacterial infections, and this goes back to the 17th century. Naturopathically, in my clinic, I'll use propolis to treat things like herpes infections or mastitis in women who are breastfeeding, that infection that they'll get in the breast tissue. Propolis and echinacea in combination and dosed appropriately and to the individual can be really helpful and effective there and safe. Traditionally, propolis was something that would have been employed by dentists before dentists even existed. It can be used as a really effective mouth rinse for dental infections. And also, there's some suggestion in the literature that the resin itself was used to fill cavities before we had any other real means to do so. Science has really shown some of the power of this medicine as an antiparasitic and antiviral and antibacterial. So namely beaver fever, for example, which when you go camping and if you drink dirty water and then you get a little bit of the trots or you get beaver fever and you get sick, that is generally from a Giardia infection, which is a particular bacteria or parasite, pardon me. And there was a study done in Cuba in 1988 where they compared head-to-head propolis and tinazidol, which is a common anti-parasitic drug that would be used to treat Giardia. And they showed that 60% of the people treated with propolis eradicated the infection, whereas the medication, it was 40%. And that was really dependent on the concentration of propolis in the alcohol extract. So you could see even half the people were cured with a 10% concentration of propolis, where 60% were cured with a 30% concentration. So the higher the concentration, the more effective. And head-to-head, it outperformed the medication. Also, antiviral, in the sense that it does two things as far as we understand from the literature at the moment, is that it strengthens the protein coats around certain types of viruses so that the virus can't break out of that coat and infect healthy cells. And at the same time, as the propolis sort of encapsulates the virus in this shell, it calls over the immune system and says, come clean this up. And so it helps speed up that immune response. So it's kind of working in two ways. And I'm speaking most specifically to herpes virus. Viruses are quite different in how they present, etc. But most of the research here isn't around herpes virus. So for example, they did a study of women with genital herpes, and they did 10 days of treatment with propolis versus acyclovir, which is a common antiviral medication used for herpes. And it showed that 24 of the 30 women treated with propolis saw full resolution of their symptoms, whereas only 14 of 30 using the medication saw any resolution of their symptoms. And women in what was called the super infection group, those who had a really bad infection, 55% of the women improved with propolis and 0% of the women improved with acyclovir. So again, head-to-head with a common medication, propolis outperforms. Propolis is potent. I use it in my clinic to treat herpes, cold sores, mastitis, those sorts of things. The last thing, well, not the last, but the next one I want to talk about is bee pollen. So bee pollen is basically when the bees land on the flowers, they're collecting pollen and nectar, and it's mixing with their digestive juices and their saliva, and they're bringing that pollen back to the hive where it ferments and acts as a food for the colony. And it is also an amazing food/medicine. Again, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, antimicrobial. Again, we could call this a superfood. Basically, if we look at the traditional uses or the Slovenian uses, it's a bit of an extrapolation there. There are a lot of amino acids, vitamins, minerals, essentially proteins as well in bee pollen. And there's some sort of historical evidence to show that Roman soldiers would use pollen cakes as a trail food. So not trail mix, but pollen cakes as something that would help them sort of move their empire further along. It was used and is used in traditional Chinese medicine to help curb sugar cravings and alcohol cravings. It's not particularly sweet, but it has a sweet sort of energetic to it that can support that and help in convalescence. So people who are coming out of severe illness, as a really potent nutritional food that doesn't require a lot of digestive fire or digestive resources to absorb. The protein in pollen ranges anywhere from 8% to 40% depending on the plant source of that pollen. It has a lot of B vitamins, and every gram contains in and around 6.5 grams of protein. Pardon me, calories, not protein. It also is shown to contain prohormones or hormones like human growth hormone, which some Russian studies have shown how it can help in the recovery for athletes and has been used with Olympic athletes in Russia for quite a while. There isn't a ton of really solid research at the moment. I haven't looked in a while, and there might have some that has emerged since, but it's weak but compelling. And so we just want to consider it as something that we can incorporate into our day-to-day. A couple teaspoons of bee pollen a day can help in terms of just getting good nutrition. But there was one study, or a couple of studies done in around bee pollen and prostate health, that the use of bee pollen can really show significant reduction in prostatitis symptoms, so inflamed prostate, which could lead to incomplete void of urine, reduced urine flow, nighttime urination. And we could see, for example, in incomplete void of urine, a 92% improvement in that symptom using bee pollen. Reduction in urine flow improved by 86%, and nighttime urination improved by 85% in this Japanese study. So again, I'm not going to call it a cure, but if those are things that some people are struggling with, why not consider incorporating it as part of your daily food intake? Honey. I won't go into a lot of detail on sort of the medicinal values of honey, just because I think propolis has really painted the picture and pollen has really painted the picture. But honey is really a wonderful way to sweeten our teas, sweeten our baked goods that maybe takes a little bit of reliance off of refined sugar. And one of the ways that we would have traditionally prepared honey in Slovenia, aside from using it raw from a jar and putting it on kruh, would be medica, or mead. And this tradition can date back as far as 1689 in Slovenia. And basically it's fermented honey wine. And so the act of fermentation itself and drinking and consuming fermented foods like sauerkraut, mead, or medica, for example, can really have a significant benefit on our digestive tract and all the healthy and helpful bugs in our digestive tract that can then translate to a more systemic, balanced, healthy organism or human body. So fermented foods and beverages are, in my clinical practice, a cornerstone of how I treat people, and it's something I invite people to consider. Do they have fermented beverages and foods in their day-to-day lifestyle? A basic recipe for mead or medica would be, you could take 4 liters of honey, 12 liters of water, boil that together for about half an hour, cool that to room temperature, add in some yeast, let it ferment in a vessel for 16 to 26 days, then bottle it, let it sit there for a couple of weeks, and then drink it from there moving forward. And it's a nice, calming, relaxing way to perhaps end the day, drinking some medica. I'd say Medica is healthier for you than a Molson Canadian. So, you know, if you're thinking about it, give it a try. And just a comment, because bees are giving us such beautiful medicine, and because they're so important to pollinating our vegetables and our flowers, and are really important for the growth of our food, that we just want to acknowledge the fact that bees are dying at significant numbers across the globe, and that we want to bring some significant awareness to this, because I think personally, given what some of the research is showing around some things like certain types of pesticides, neonicotinoids, for example, Roundup, those sorts of things are really having a significant impact on the health of bee colonies worldwide. And I think we would do well to heed that warning and start to make some significant changes there. Essentially, that wraps up this episode of our Slovenski Dom online seminars and this presentation around natural medicines of Slovenia. I want to say thank you very much for listening. I hope that you really gained some information or some knowledge, or at least a sense of deeper connection to your roots and to the medicine that is in our blood, that is in our DNA, and that hopefully in some way, shape, or form you can get excited about, and that you can incorporate into your day-to-day lifestyle for the benefit of your health and the benefit of your well-being. So thanks for listening.